Thanks for joining me again for devotional this afternoon. Hope you all are having a great day. Today, I want to talk about a passage just read a couple days ago, and there are a lot of biblical stories that honestly kind of leave me scratching my head. Sometimes that's because there's just some gaps in the information we're given, and we're not given all the details. Sometimes that's, I think, because it's just plain over my head. It's just beyond my ability to understand it. One of those stories that leaves me scratching my head, and I'm not sure it's the lack of details or it is just over my head, probably some of both, is the story of Jacob and the striped sticks, where he carves these stripes and sticks in Genesis 30. Now, before I kind of get to that passage and talk about it, just want to remind you a little bit about Jacob. Jacob's a guy that's kind of hard to sum up. He's a guy that kind of defies a simple description, like he's just a good guy or he's just a bad guy, because he's just kind of a mix, like most of us, especially in his younger years. Jacob was a pretty conniving guy at times, but you also see later he was a real hard worker. He was a prayerful man. He trusted God. He's probably best remembered, though, for ripping off his brother Esau by deceiving his father Isaac, and got his brother Esau so upset that he had to flee his home country in Canaan and take off elsewhere. He was kind of a mama's boy, and mama sent him off to live with his uncle to get away from Esau. And he ended up living with his uncle Laban for the next 20 years. But on his way there, God met with him in a dream and promised to be with him and to bless him and eventually to bring him back to the promised land of Canaan someday. So like I said, Jacob was a schemer, but he ends up with his uncle Laban, and it turns out Laban was also a kind of conniving schemer. So seems fair. That's where Jacob ends up. And you know the story. Jacob falls in love with Laban's daughter Rachel and agrees to work for 7 years to earn the right to marry her. After 7 years, thinks he's going to be with Rachel. Laban pulls a little trick, and Jacob ends up marrying Rachel's older sister Leah. Gets upset about it. There's some negotiations go on, and eventually Jacob agrees to work another 7 years so that he can also marry the younger daughter Rachel, who he originally wanted to marry. So another 7 years of labor to get the right to marry Rachel. And then when we get to Genesis chapter 30, this is the point where Jacob has been working for his uncle for 14 years now. He's free of his commitment that he's originally made to Laban. And we're told that over that period of time, he's getting pretty low wages from his uncle for his work. Matter of fact, we're told that Jacob's wages were changed 10 times over those 14 years. And it's pretty clear that those were not wage increases, that his uncle Laban was pretty much ripping him off for his work. But now Jacob has finally fulfilled his commitment to his uncle, and he wants to return home with his family, with his two wives and his kids. But it's been revealed to Laban that the reason that he has succeeded, that his wealth has grown and has so much livestock, is because the Lord has blessed him because of Jacob's presence there and Jacob's work. So he doesn't want Jacob to leave. So he tries to talk Jacob into staying. And Jacob eventually agrees that he will, because he wants to start working on building up a flock of his own to take care of his family. And so he makes his uncle Laban a great offer. He says that he will stay there and continue to work for him for the time being. But the deal is that he will get to keep every speckled, spotted, or black sheep and every speckled or spotted goat, those that exist now and those that will be born into the flock. Those will be his. And this was a good deal. The reason it was a good deal was because a tenant farmer in that time would normally have gotten 10 to 20% of the livestock that they had raised for the owner of the farm. And I'm told this, I don't know that much actually about livestock, but I'm told that these speckled and spotted sheep and goats were actually fairly unusual, and it would have really amounted to quite a bit less than the 10 to 20% of Laban's flock. So Jacob makes him this great deal. Laban takes the deal. But Laban, because he is this conniving schemer, he makes the deal, but it seems like as soon as his son-in-law's back is turned, he then takes every spotted and speckled sheep and goat out of the herd, and he sends them 3 days' travel away to be with his sons. He sends his sons off with all these animals, to rip off Jacob. Jacob's clear that he made this deal because he wants it to be clear in the end what livestock is his and what livestock belongs to his father-in-law. He understood his father-in-law was probably going to rip him off. And this was a real clear system. It's going to be clear which animals belong to me. You can just look and tell which animals belong to you. And again, Laban, in his usual way, rips his son-in-law off, takes those animals out. So he not only loses the animals that originally should have been his, but it's also less likely that more will be born that are abnormally colored because of genetics and the way things have been now worked out. And then we come to the part of the story that always leaves me a little bit scratching my head. So Genesis 30, verses 37 to 39, we're told about this sort of weird selective breeding program that Jacob initiates. So here's in verse 37. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And then the story goes on and tells about some other kind of selective breeding techniques that Jacob applied to try and encourage his flock to be more speckled, spotted, and striped. And then the end result in verse 43 is, thus the man, who was Jacob, increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So this approach worked. Now, I've actually read in some papers and in commentaries where some people have explained this, putting these sticks in the water troughs, by saying that poplar, almond, and plane trees, that they have some substances in them that were believed to be medicinal, that served medicinal purposes in that time. And that's why he put them in there. They were sort of nutrients, providing nutrients in the water to make the animals that he was breeding healthier, but also to encourage pregnancy, that there was some of these substances may have actually made it more likely that the animals would get pregnant. And so that's why he was putting those sticks in there. But when you read in verse 39, it says, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. So he's not just saying here that they were more likely to get pregnant because of the sticks, or that they would be healthier, stronger animals because of the nutrients in the water. He's also saying something about being in front of these striped sticks made them likely to give birth to striped, speckled, and spotted animals, which is just strange. And it seems likely, many have said, that Jacob actually believed a superstition of the day, a tradition of that day, that said that whatever the female sheep was looking at, would see while mating, would have a profound impact upon their offspring. So it seems possible, maybe even likely, that Jacob was following some of the kind of traditional folk medicine of the day and applying it to have a flock that was healthy and more likely to give birth to more livestock, but also may have believed some substitution, some superstitions. Boy, I'm having a hard time with that word. Superstitions of the day, and that he was applying that to his breeding system. But whatever is the case, what we know is it worked. That in the end, he had lots of animals born that became his, that were speckled, spotted, and streaked. But in the next chapter, in chapter 31, Jacob tells us that he understood that the reason he was blessed, that the reason things had gone so well for him, was because of God. He understood that it was actually God who was blessing him. Despite his father-in-law's continued attempts to rob him, he knew that the reason things were going well for him and he was blessed was because of God's grace, God's care for him. So why did he do all this stuff? It's kind of the question. And why would God allow, if it was some superstition he's following, for it to succeed the way it did? Well, I think sometimes we just need to admit that we don't fully understand what's happening. I don't mean it's wrong to look for answers to our questions, that we shouldn't keep searching, but I think we also need to be ready sometimes to admit that it's a mystery. It's simply beyond us. There's not enough information given, or it's simply beyond our ability to understand because God's far beyond our understanding. That He's not revealed everything about us, and we can't understand everything about Him. Uh, and again, I think there's probably some truth in the research that says maybe there were beneficial nutrients that were in the water by him doing this, and that helped his livestock. But I also think that we have this need often to make someone totally deserving of what God did for them. And I think in this case, there is a temptation to want to make Jacob somebody who was a totally faithful man who was only doing what God had instructed him to do and didn't believe in some silly superstition, because of course God wouldn't have blessed him if that was any part of it. For a story to be a good story, a lot of times we have to believe that the person who is blessed is a person who deserves what they receive. Um, but again, I think that there are a lot of times in Scripture where God blesses people not because they deserved it, but simply because He is a gracious God. And why do we struggle so to believe that God could bless Jacob despite his very human imperfections and his immaturities? Why is it such a problem to us that Jacob could be a man who believed in God and followed God, but also sometimes believed fully superstitions and sometimes took things into his own hands, even when he really didn't need to, sometimes schemed and planned and relied on himself in ways that really were not fully trusting God? Because that happens all the time. We do that all the time. We see that in the stories and scriptures all the time. That God will even take some things that are foolish, and sometimes even God will take actions that were absolutely wrong, and He will redeem those actions for His good purposes, just like He did with Jacob's scheming in his youth. Jacob again was doing some clearly wrong things, but God still blessed him. God still used him to fulfill His good purposes through Jacob. So again, I think deep down we kind of have this belief that everyone has to deserve the blessings they receive, but that's really not the message at the center of the story. Matter of fact, I don't think Jacob is really the central character in this story. I think the central character in the story really is God, and this is really not so much a story about Jacob and what he deserves. This is a story about God and how faithful He is. God blesses him and protects him, takes care of him just as He would promised He would do. Not because he deserved it or did everything right, not because he never had questionable beliefs or methods, but because God is a faithful God. God does what He says He will do. God is faithful to carry out His word. Rather than this being a story of Jacob's goodness, I think this is a story of God's faithfulness. He's the center of the story. God keeps His promises. He follows through on those things He said He'll do. He does sometimes discipline and withhold blessings in order to teach us and grow us, which is ultimately a blessing. But His blessings aren't earned. They are the result of His grace. I love the words of a pastor and teacher, Arthur Pink, and he wrote these words back in the early 1900s. But as you hear them, I think you'll agree with me, they could apply just as well today. Pink wrote this: unfaithfulness is one of the most outstanding sins of these evil days. In the business world, a man's word is, with exceedingly rare exceptions, no longer his bond. In the social world, marital infidelity abounds on every hand, the sacred bonds of wedlock being broken with as little regard as the discarding of an old garment. In the ecclesiastical realm, thousands who have solemnly covenanted to preach the truth make no scruple to attack and deny it. Nor can reader or writer claim complete immunity from this fearful sin. In how many ways have we been unfaithful to Christ and to the light and the privileges which God has entrusted to us? Again, I think a description of today, just as well as early 1900s, maybe even more so today, that faithfulness is a rare quality. To really trust someone's word, to really follow through on a commitment, it is too rare a quality today. But then Pink goes on and says, how refreshing then, how unspeakably blessed to lift our eyes above this scene of ruin and behold one who is faithful, faithful in all things, faithful at all times. I think this is a story about that. This is a story I don't understand at all. But what is clear from beginning to end of Jacob's story is that God was faithful. God is faithful despite the ups and downs in Jacob's life. God is faithful despite sometimes his sin, sometimes his Jacob's faithfulness, Jacob's unfaithfulness doesn't change the fact that from beginning to end, God is a faithful God. He's a God you can count upon his word. You can count upon his love. You can count upon his power to follow through on his plans and to keep his promises. He's a faithful God. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And again, thank you for joining me. Have a good day.